The call came on a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because I had spent the entire afternoon doing something I loved, something that, for most people, would feel like work, but for me had always felt like breathing. I was sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by seating charts. 47 tables, 312 guests. Name cards in a cream envelope font I had chosen after testing 11 different typefaces across 2 weekends. A color-coded spreadsheet open on my laptop. A mug of tea on my right, Earl Grey gone cold hours ago, and on my left, a stack of vendor confirmations I had printed, highlighted, and paper-clipped in the order they needed to be followed up on. 3 weeks. That was all that was left. 3 weeks until the wedding I had spent 8 months of my life building, detail by careful, deliberate, loving detail. I was a wedding planner by profession. I had organized 41 weddings in 6 years. I had held brides' hands through venue disasters and florist meltdowns, and one truly unforgettable occasion when a wedding cake slid off a catering table 20 minutes before the reception. I had seen it all. And then I had decided, with the particular kind of hubris that belongs only to people who know exactly how things can go wrong, that I was going to plan my own. My name is Claire. I was 31 years old. I was 3 weeks away from marrying a man named Ryan, who I had loved for 4 years with my whole heart and both hands. And on a Tuesday afternoon, with my seating charts spread across the table and my cold tea at my elbow, my phone rang. It was Aunt Carol, she said, and I can still hear exactly how she said it, the particular careful quiet of her voice, like she was choosing each word the way you choose footing on ice. She said, "Claire, sweetheart, I need you to sit down." I didn't sit down, I was already sitting, but what she meant was something different. What she meant was, brace yourself. What she meant was, what I am about to say is going to change everything. I didn't know that yet. I said, "Aunt Carol, I'm in the middle of the seating charts is everything." And she said, "It's about Jess." I want to stop here, before I take you all the way back to the beginning, before I show you everything that led to that Tuesday. I need you to understand one thing. Jess was not just my sister. She was the person I would have called if my world was ending. She was the person I called when I got my first big client, and when I crashed my car at 23, and when Ryan proposed on a rainy Thursday evening in November and I stood in a restaurant with tears running down my face and my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the ring on my finger. She was the first person I called. Before Mom, before my closest friends. Jess. She was 27 years old. She was funny in the kind of way that sneaks up on you, not showy, not performing, just quietly, unexpectedly hilarious in a way that made you feel like the funniest person in the room just for being near her. She had her dad's dark eyes and her mom's stubbornness and a laugh that I had been hearing my whole life. She was my maid of honor. And on that Tuesday, with 3 weeks left until my wedding, Aunt Carol told me everything. Before I take you back to where this really began, if you're new here, I want to welcome you. Every episode is a real woman's story about betrayal, about silence, about the moment she finally chose herself. Hit subscribe so you're here when the next one drops. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Ryan and I met the way most people don't expect to meet the person they're going to marry. It wasn't at a party. It wasn't through a mutual friend. It wasn't some cinematic moment in a bookshop or a coffee queue. We met at a complaints desk. I know how that sounds. I was 26, newly self-employed, running my fledgling wedding planning business out of a spare room in a flat I shared with 2 other people. I was at a large event supplies company trying to return 300 chair sashes in the wrong shade of ivory. The vendor had sent me champagne, and the bride had specifically, in writing, requested ivory, and I was not going to let that go. Ryan was behind the counter. He was 31, tall, brown-haired, with the kind of calm that you either find deeply reassuring or mildly infuriating depending on the day. On that particular day, when I was standing there with 2 boxes of chair sashes and a very firm expression, I found it reassuring. He sorted the exchange. He was professional and efficient and not the least bit rattled by me. And as I was leaving, he said, very quietly, so the colleagues on either side of him wouldn't hear, "For what it's worth, I think you were completely right." I turned back, I said, "I know." He smiled, I smiled. 3 days later, he found me on LinkedIn, professional, not weird, I want to be clear, and sent a message that said simply, "I wanted to apologize for the chair sashes. Can I make it up to you with coffee?" I said yes. We went for coffee, then dinner. Then a weekend away 6 weeks later, which felt fast but felt right, the way some things do when you know, in that place below logic, that this is a person your life has room for. He was kind, he was steady. He remembered things, small things, the kind that don't matter unless they're forgotten, like the name of my first client and the anniversary of when I'd started my business, and the fact that I don't like mushrooms, but I'll eat them if they're cooked into something so I don't have to see them whole. He was the kind of person who showed up, not just for the good things, for the hard ones too. We moved in together after 18 months. We got a dog, a ridiculous, overly affectionate Labrador named Biscuit, after 2 years. Ryan proposed after 3 years, 8 months, and as he would tell me later, approximately 47 different attempts to find the right moment, all of which he had talked himself out of. He finally did it on a Thursday in November, in the Italian restaurant where we'd had our third date. With the ring, he'd been hiding in his desk drawer at work for 2 months. It was not a grand gesture. There were no balloons, no flash mobs, no restaurant full of strangers clapping. He just looked at me across the table and said very simply, "I want to do this with you. Everything, is that okay with you?" I said yes before he'd finished the sentence. The first person I called was Jess. Now, I need to tell you about Jess, not the Jess I would learn about later. The Jess I knew then. We were 4 years apart, me the elder, and we had grown up in the kind of close, cheerfully chaotic household where the television was always on, and someone was always either laughing or arguing, and Sunday dinners lasted 3 hours because no one could bear to leave the table. We fought, of course. We were sisters. We fought about clothes borrowed without asking, and about the bathroom, and about who Mum loved more, which we both knew was neither of us equally, and also somehow both of us completely, because that is the paradox of being loved by a particular kind of mother. But underneath all of that, beneath the arguments and the borrowed cardigans and the years when we were teenagers and couldn't be in the same room for more than 40 minutes without someone storming off, there was something that I thought was unbreakable. Trust. I trusted Jess the way you trust the ground under your feet. Not consciously, not with effort, just it was there. It held you up. You didn't think about it because you didn't have to. When I told her Ryan had proposed, she screamed. She genuinely screamed, a long, high, delighted noise that made her housemate come running from the other room to check if she was injured. She said, "Tell me everything. Tell me every single word he said." And I did. The engagement was a beautiful thing to live inside. There is a specific quality to that period of time, between the proposal and the wedding, that I think is hard to describe unless you've been in it. It's a kind of suspended joy. Everything feels saturated. You walk through ordinary days, a supermarket, a commute, a Tuesday, and the ordinariness of it is lit up from underneath by the knowledge that something extraordinary is coming. I threw myself into planning with the particular enthusiasm of someone who does this for a living and therefore had opinions. Capital O. Opinions about venue acoustics and catering ratios, and the precise question of whether Pampa's grass was still elegant or had crossed into overused, a debate I had with myself for several weeks before landing definitively on. It depends on the vase. And Jess was there for all of it. Every venue visit, every florist consultation. Three separate trips to bridal boutiques before I found the dress, and Jess sat in every velvet chair in every shop and gave me her honest opinion every time, which is a gift that sounds simple but is actually enormous because most people, when asked, "Does this look right?" will tell you what they think you want to hear. Not Jess. Jess said things like, "That silhouette doesn't suit you and I love you too much to pretend it does." She said, this is the one, I don't care what anyone else thinks." She said when I finally found the dress, ivory, not champagne, with a low back and buttons all the way down the spine, she said nothing at all for a moment, and then she said very quietly, "Claire, that's it, that's the one." She was right. She was always right about things like that. Jess had an eye. She could walk into a room and immediately understand what it needed, what color was missing, what piece of furniture was wrong, which flower arrangement was fighting with the light. She was wasted in her job, which was something to do with data analysis at a logistics company, a job she found mildly tolerable and occasionally interesting but never loved. I used to say to her, "You should work with me. You have the instinct." She used to laugh and say, "I'd drive you mad within a week." Maybe she was right about that too. Looking back, and I've had a long time to look back, I can see the signs now. The small things I noticed and set aside, the moments that didn't quite add up. But at the time, I wasn't looking for signs. I was planning a wedding. I was happy. And happiness, I've learned, can make you very blind. There was one evening in particular, about 4 months before the wedding, that I've thought about many times since. At the time, it meant nothing to me. Now it means everything. The evening was a Friday in January. Ryan and I had been out for dinner, just the two of us, nothing special, a local place we liked, and we'd come home to find 3 missed calls on my phone from Jess. I called her back immediately because that's what I did. 3 missed calls from Jess meant something was wrong. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was fine, completely fine. She said she'd just been trying to reach me, that she'd wanted to ask about the bridesmaid dress fitting scheduled for the following week. That was it. That was the reason for 3 missed calls on a Friday night. I remember thinking briefly that it was a little odd. The fitting wasn't urgent. It was 10 days away. But Jess could be impulsive and she got anxious about logistics, and I was tired and happy from dinner, so I answered her questions about the fitting and we talked for 20 minutes about something else entirely, and I forgot about it. I forgot about it. I think about that now. The fitting itself went smoothly. All 4 bridesmaids, including Jess, in a sage green that I had agonized over for 6 weeks, and that looked in the end exactly as I'd hoped, soft and warm, flattering on everyone, exactly right against the late summer flowers I was using. We'd gone for lunch afterward, all 5 of us, and it had been one of those meals that stretches long past what you planned because no one wants to leave. Because the wine is good and the conversation keeps finding new rooms to explore, it was a good day. But there were other days. Smaller days I didn't pay much attention to at the time. The vendor meeting in March that Jess said she'd be at and then canceled an hour before with a text that said, "Something came up at work, so sorry, tell me everything after." That happened twice, 2 separate vendor meetings, 2 last-minute cancellations. I thought nothing of it. Work was hectic. Things came up. The time, in April, about 3 months before the wedding, when I mentioned Ryan's name in conversation and Jess went very quiet for a moment, just a beat, barely noticeable, just a fraction of silence before she responded, and I thought, she's tired. She looks tired. The weekend, also in April, when Ryan said he was going to a colleague's birthday drinks on the Saturday and came home later than expected. And when I asked how it was, he said, "Good. Yeah, quiet," in that slightly flat way that men sometimes describe social events that were fine but not memorable, and I thought nothing of it. Nothing. I want to be clear about something. I was not naive. I was not unworldly. I was a 31-year-old woman who had been in relationships before, who had been hurt before, who knew that people were complicated and that love was not a guarantee. But I had looked at Ryan, at 4 years of Ryan, at the man who remembered my business anniversary and cooked dinner on the nights I came home too tired to think, and held my hand through the difficult conversations we'd had about the future, about children, about what we each needed. I had looked at all of that and I had believed in it. And I had looked at Jess, at 27 years of Jess, at my entire life of Jess, and I had believed in that too. The problem with trusting people completely is that it doesn't leave any room for doubt. And doubt sometimes is what keeps you safe. There was one moment when I almost found out. 3 months before the wedding. If I had paid attention, if I had asked the question that was forming in my mind and then dissolving before it reached my lips, everything might have been different. I've asked myself 1,000 times, would I have wanted to know sooner? I still don't have an answer. But let me tell you about the phone call, the one that changed everything. The one that came on a Tuesday 3 weeks before my wedding, when I was sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by seating charts. Before I tell you what Aunt Carol said, I want to pause for just a second. Because if you've ever been in a moment like this, if you've ever trusted someone completely, given them access to your whole life, and then had that trust shattered, I want you to know this story is for you. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you've been through. I read every single one, and if this story is already making your chest tight, give it a like so more women can find it. Okay. The call. Aunt Carol was my dad's older sister. She was 58, widowed 4 years ago, and had since settled into a life that suited her. A cottage garden she tended with fierce devotion, a book club she attended every fortnight, and an absolute refusal to entertain nonsense from anyone. She called things what they were. She did not believe in softening difficult truths to the point where they became unrecognizable. Which is why, when she called me on that Tuesday, she didn't spend very long getting to the point. She told me she had been in a restaurant on the other side of the city the previous Saturday. She had gone with a friend, a lunch she'd been looking forward to for weeks, a place they'd both been meaning to try. They were seated by the window. It was a nice table. And at a table across the room, she had seen 2 people. She described them carefully. A man, Brown hair, tall, wearing a gray jacket she recognized because she had seen it before at Christmas at my parents' house. And a woman with dark hair, laughing at something he was saying, leaning toward him across the table in the way that people lean when they are interested in more than the conversation. She said she watched them for a few minutes, thinking she must be mistaken. Hoping she was mistaken. She was not mistaken. She saw Ryan reach across the table and put his hand over Jess's. She saw Jess turn her hand over and hold it. And then, this is the part that I keep coming back to, even now, even after everything. She saw Jess laugh again at something Ryan said. And as she laughed, she reached up to push her hair back from her face, and Aunt Carol saw that she was wearing a pair of small gold earrings. Earrings I recognized from the description. Earrings I had lent Jess 6 weeks earlier when she said she was going to a work event and couldn't find anything to wear with her outfit. I was standing at my kitchen table when Aunt Carol said this. The seating charts were in front of me. I could see my own name and Ryan's at the top of the spreadsheet, in a little box I had made that said bride and groom in the font I had spent 2 weekends choosing. I said nothing for a very long moment. Aunt Carol said, "Claire, are you still there?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm so sorry, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to call until I was sure. I've been sitting with this since Saturday and I said, "It's okay, thank you for telling me." My voice sounded completely normal. I was distantly surprised by this. I put the phone down. I stood at my table. I looked at the seating chart. I looked at the name on it, Ryan, in the font I had chosen. I called Ryan. He answered on the second ring. He answered quickly, too quickly maybe, or maybe I'm reading that in now. I said, "Where were you last Saturday?" A pause, a brief one. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Last Saturday, where were you?" He said, "I told you I went to Danny's thing, the birthday drinks." I said, "What restaurant did you go to?" Another pause, longer this time. I said, "Ryan." He said, "Claire, what's going on?" I said, "I need you to tell me the truth. Right now, I need you to tell me the truth and I need you to not lie to me." The silence that followed was 10 seconds long. I counted. I don't know why I counted. Something in me needed to be counting something, measuring something, finding something in that moment that I could hold on to. He said, "I'm sorry." 2 words, "I'm sorry." Not a denial, not a question, not confusion, just "I'm sorry." That was when I knew. I said, "I'm going to hang up now." He said, "Claire, please." I hung up. I called Jess. It went to voicemail. Her voicemail message was bright and familiar, her voice, the one I had heard my entire life, cheerful and slightly rushed the way she always was on recorded messages. "Hi, it's Jess. Leave me a message and I'll call you back, promise." I didn't leave a message. I sat down at my kitchen table. The seating charts were still spread in front of me. I thought, I need to deal with these later. I thought, the florist confirmation is due by Friday. I thought, I have 47 tables and 312 guests and an ivory dress with buttons all the way down the spine. And then I stopped thinking entirely for a while. I don't know how long I sat there. It might have been 20 minutes. It might have been an hour. When my phone rang again, it was Jess. I answered. I said, "I am proud of how calm I was." Genuinely looking back, I said, "I need you to tell me the truth, all of it, right now." She said, "Claire." I said, "All of it, Jess." There was a very long silence, and then she said it. The sentence I have thought about more times than I can count, the sentence I will probably think about for the rest of my life. She said, "Claire, we didn't plan it, it just happened." It just happened. I have had a lot of time to think about those 4 words. About what they reveal. About what they ask you to believe. They ask you to believe that two people who were, between them, responsible for the most significant relationship in my life, who had access to my home and my future and every detail of the wedding I had been building for 8 months. They ask you to believe that these 2 people simply found themselves, accidentally, in a situation they hadn't chosen. They ask you to believe that months. I learned later it had been at least 4 months. Possibly 5, that months of meetings, of secret Saturdays, of a hand reaching across a restaurant table, of my earrings in my sister's ears, had all simply happened. As if they had been caught in a current. As if they had no hands. As if neither of them, at any point in the previous 4 or 5 months, had looked at what they were doing and at me and made a choice. I said, "How long?" She said, "Claire." I said, "How long, Jess?" She said, "Since February." February. The February before a July wedding. 5 months. The February when I had been deep in venue negotiations and catering discussions and had come home more than once to Jess on my sofa with wine open, ostensibly there to help me plan, and she had sat with me and looked at photographs of centerpiece arrangements and told me which ones she thought were most beautiful. I said, "Does Ryan want to be with you?" She said, I don't know. Claire, I said, "Does he love you?" She was crying now, I could hear it. The sound of my sister crying was one of the most familiar sounds of my life from childhood onwards, and sitting there at my kitchen table, I felt something very complicated happen in my chest, grief and fury, and something that might in another life have been compassion. I said, "I'm going to need some time." She said, "Claire, please, I need you to," I said. "I'll call you when I'm ready." I hung up. I sat at my table for another long while. Then I opened my laptop, and I began methodically, professionally, with the calm that years of crisis management in other people's weddings had given me. I began to cancel my own. The venue, the florist, the caterer, the photographer, the string quartet, the cake, 47 tables, 312 guests. I worked for 6 hours straight. I barely stood up. Some vendors were sympathetic. Some were businesslike. Some I could hear were trying not to say I've seen this before and managing it with varying degrees of success. I was professional with all of them. I said there had been a change in circumstances. I did not elaborate. At some point I moved the seating chart to the other end of the table. At some point I made fresh tea. At some point Biscuit, our dog, my dog, I suppose now, came and put his head on my knee. And I put my hand on his head, and that was the first time I cried. My mother called the next morning. I had not yet spoken to my parents. I had sent a message the evening before, brief, factual, saying that the wedding would not be going ahead and that I would explain soon. I'd known it would not hold them for long. Mum called at 8:45 in the morning. I was on my third cup of tea and had barely slept. I answered. She said, "Claire." I said, "Hi, Mum." She said, "I've spoken to Jess." I said nothing. She said, "She's absolutely devastated, Claire. She barely slept. She's been—" I said, "Mum." She said, "I just think, I know this is so hard, I know, but I think if you could just hear her out." I said, "She slept with my fiancé." Silence. I said, "For 5 months while I was planning our wedding. She slept with Ryan for 5 months, and she sat on my sofa and helped me choose centerpieces, and she stood in a bridal boutique and told me she loved my dress." My mother said very quietly, "I know." I said, "And your first call is to tell me she's devastated." Another silence. My mother said, "She's my daughter, Claire, you both are, I don't know what to do." And I understood in that moment, with a clarity that was almost cold, that my mother was going to spend the coming weeks trying to stand in the middle, trying to keep both of us, trying to prevent the fracture from becoming permanent. I understood it. I even, in some distant way, recognized the impossible position she was in. And I also knew with the same cold clarity that it was not going to be enough. That what I needed from my mother in that moment was not balance. It was not diplomacy. It was not "she's devastated, Claire." What I needed was for someone to say this was wrong. What Jess did was wrong. What Ryan did was wrong. And I am saying that first before anything else because you are my daughter and you deserved better. My mother didn't say that. My father called later that afternoon. He said less. He said he was sorry. He said he loved me. He said he didn't know what to say. I believed all 3 things and I thanked him and we said goodbye. My cousin Sophie sent a message that said, "I heard, I'm so sorry. I knew something was off, but I didn't want to. I'm sorry. Are you okay?" I stared at that message for a long time. I knew something was off. She had known. Someone in my family had known or suspected and had said nothing. I didn't respond to Sophie that day. I didn't respond for a long time. That evening, Aunt Carol came over. She didn't call first. She just appeared at my door with a bag of groceries and a bottle of good wine, not cheap wine, proper wine, the kind you open when something significant is happening. And she looked at me and said, "Right, let's eat something." We sat on my kitchen floor. I don't know why the floor. It just happened. We slid down the kitchen cupboards and sat on the floor with our plates and our wine and biscuit pressed against both of us. And Aunt Carol talked about her late husband, about the things she'd had to rebuild after he died, about the particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from losing the specific person you had organized your expectations around. She didn't tell me what to do. She didn't tell me what to feel. She didn't tell me that Ryan wasn't worth it or that Jess would regret this forever or that I would find someone better. She just sat with me on the floor. And at some point, without planning to, I started to cry in a way I hadn't yet, not the quiet tears at the kitchen table, but the real kind. The kind that comes from somewhere below the rib cage and isn't elegant or controlled. The kind that sounds terrible and doesn't stop for a while. Aunt Carol put her arm around me. She said, "I know," and that was enough. "I want to tell you what happened with Ryan because, and this surprised me looking back, it was simpler than I expected. Less dramatic, less like the kind of confrontation you see in films. It was, in its own way, more devastating for being so quiet. And I want to tell you about the months that followed, about what I learned, about what I chose, because the end of this story is not what you might expect. Ryan and I met once. About a week after the Tuesday. He came to the flat to collect his things. We had arranged it by text, carefully, like people trying to move breakable objects across a great distance without dropping them. He had been staying at a friend's place. Biscuit was at Aunt Carol's for the day because I couldn't manage both things at once. He came in. He looked awful, in the way that people look when they haven't been sleeping and they know it's their own fault and they're not sure whether they're entitled to look as bad as they feel. He said, "Claire, I'm so sorry." I said, "I know." He said, I don't have an excuse, there isn't one." I said, "No." He stood in the hallway of the flat we had shared for 2.5 years and he looked at me with the expression of a man who has understood fully and completely the size of the thing he has done. And I looked at him. I looked at 4 years. I looked at the person who had remembered my business anniversary and cooked dinner and proposed in the restaurant where we'd had our 3rd date. I said, "Did you love her?" He looked at the floor. He said, "I don't know. I don't know." I said, "Did you love me?" He looked up. He said, "Yes, I did. I do. That's the part I can't." I said, "Okay." I said, "You can get your things." He packed 2 bags. He left most things for later. At the door he turned back and said, "For what it's worth, and I know it isn't worth very much, I'm sorry. Not just for what I did. For what I didn't do, which was tell you the moment I knew something was wrong. I should have told you, I'm sorry." I said, "I know." He left. I stood in the hallway for a while. Then I went and collected Biscuit from Aunt Carol's and I brought him home, and we sat on the sofa and watched 3 hours of television I cannot remember at all. And I ate a bowl of cereal for dinner, and I went to bed at 9 o'clock. That was that. The weeks that followed were strange. Strange because grief is strange. Not clean, not linear, not the way you might expect. There were days when I was fine, genuinely fine, functional, professional, booking new clients and answering emails and going for runs in the morning with Biscuit that I actually enjoyed. And then there were evenings when I would be doing something completely ordinary, washing up, or folding laundry, or watching something on television. And I would suddenly, without warning, remember something, the restaurant where he proposed, the font I had chosen for the name cards, the dress. The dress was the hardest. It was still in my wardrobe in the bag the boutique had given me with the tissue paper tucked around it. I didn't look at it for 2 months. And then one morning I took it out and I looked at it, the ivory silk, the low back, the buttons all the way down the spine, and I thought, that is a beautiful dress. And then I called the boutique and asked if they could take it on consignment. They sold it within 3 weeks. I hope whoever bought it loved it. My relationship with my mother during this time was difficult in the way that only a relationship with a parent can be difficult, layered, old, full of history that has nothing to do with the present situation but somehow keeps finding its way into it. She never stopped reaching out. She called. She sent messages. She turned up once unannounced with a casserole, and I let her in and we sat at the kitchen table and she said again that she hoped I would eventually be able to hear Jess out, that she hoped the family could find a way through. I said very calmly, "Mum, I love you and I'm not ready for this conversation yet." She accepted it, she didn't push. And I genuinely think that restraint cost her something and I give her credit for it. We found our way back, slowly, imperfectly, with gaps between us that hadn't been there before, but we found it. My father, who had said less about everything, showed up in the way that quiet people sometimes show up, consistently, without fanfare, simply being there. He texted every few days. Nothing much. "How are you doing? Biscuit okay. Thinking of you." It was enough. It was more than enough. And Jess. Jess sent messages. Many messages in the first weeks. Long ones. Pages sometimes. Explanations and apologies and descriptions of her own feelings, her own confusion, her own grief. Some of them were heartfelt. Some of them I felt were more focused on her processing her guilt than on what I might need. I read all of them. I did not respond to most of them. I was not ready. And I had learned in the aftermath of all of this that not ready was a complete sentence. I did not owe anyone my readiness. I did not owe anyone a timeline. I focused instead on what I had. I had work. Good work, the kind that asked things of me, that pulled my attention out of my own head and placed it firmly in the practical, solvable problems of other people's perfect days. I was good at my job. I had always known that, but in those months it became something more than a professional fact. It became a lifeline. Organizing other people's joy turned out to be unexpectedly, improbably, one of the things that helped. I had Aunt Carol, who appeared at regular intervals with wine and groceries and the kind of company that doesn't ask anything of you. I had Biscuit, who was indifferent to human tragedy in the way that dogs are, not unkindly, just practically. He needed walks. He needed dinner. He needed to be on the sofa even though he wasn't really supposed to be on the sofa. The routine of him was a gift. And I had slowly something else. I had myself back. This is the part of the story I find hardest to describe, not because it was painful, though it was sometimes, but because it was quiet. And quiet things are harder to articulate than loud ones. In the months after the wedding that didn't happen, I began to understand something about myself that I had not understood before, or perhaps I had understood it but had not been paying attention. I was very good at giving myself away, not in a dramatic sense, not all at once, but in the small, accumulated way that people give themselves away over years, making your preferences smaller, making your needs quieter, finding yourself in places and situations and conversations that you have arranged around someone else's comfort at the gentle expense of your own. I had done this with Ryan, I realized. Not because he had asked me to, he hadn't, not directly, but because I was good at it. Because it was a skill I had developed over years of being in relationship, of being the one who kept things smooth, the one who adapted, the one who said I don't mind, whatever you want, and mostly meant it but sometimes did mind a little, and set it aside so small that it disappeared. And with Jess, I had been doing it my whole life, making room for her, being careful of her feelings, choosing in the moments when I might have asked the question forming in my mind to let it dissolve instead, because the trust was simpler, because the love was easier if you didn't press on it too hard. I was done being careful of other people's feelings at the expense of my own. It was not an angry decision. It was not a defiant one. It was very, very quiet. It felt like standing up straight. I took on a client that summer who was planning a wedding in the Scottish Highlands. The venue was extraordinary, a converted estate overlooking a loch, the kind of place that makes you stop talking when you first see it because words feel inadequate. I drove up alone. I stayed for 4 days, doing site visits and vendor meetings and walking around the grounds at dusk with Biscuit, who I had brought because Aunt Carol said he'd love it. And she was absolutely right. Standing at the edge of the loch one evening, with the light doing something extraordinary to the water and Biscuit completely ignoring the ducks in a way that required enormous canine self-control, I felt something shift. Not dramatically, not a revelation, just a settling, like something that had been slightly off balance finding its center. I thought, I am going to be all right. Not in the everything happens for a reason sense, which I have never believed in. Not in the something better is coming sense, which may or may not be true but felt beside the point. Just I am going to be all right. I am here. I have my work and my dog and an aunt who turns up with wine and a knowledge of myself that is clearer and truer than it has ever been. That is enough. That is more than enough. 6 months after the Tuesday, I was at my desk on a Wednesday afternoon. A different desk. I had moved flat by then, a smaller place that was entirely mine in a way the previous one never quite was, and my phone rang. It was Jess. I looked at her name on the screen for a long moment. I answered. Her voice was very different from the last time I had heard it, small, careful, like she was walking into a room she wasn't sure she was allowed to enter. She said, "Claire, I'm hi." I said, "Hi." She said, "I didn't know if you'd answer." I said, "I wasn't sure I would either." A pause. She said, "Ryan and I, it's over. It's been over for a couple of months. I just thought, I don't know, I felt like you should know. I'm not telling you because I think it changes anything. I know it doesn't. She started crying, not the performing kind. The real kind. She said, "I'm so sorry, Claire. I am so sorry for what I did. And I don't need you to forgive me. I don't expect that. I needed you to hear me say it." I listened to all of it. I sat at my desk in my new flat and I listened to my sister cry, and I felt something complicated, not nothing, not cold. Something that was made of love and grief and a boundary that had quietly, permanently changed shape. When she had finished, I said, "I hear you." She said, "I love you. I know that probably sounds." I said, "I know." A long pause. I said, "Jess, I hope you find peace." She said, "Claire," I said, "I mean that. I genuinely mean it. I hope you find peace." And I said goodbye, and I put the phone down. And I sat at my desk for a few minutes with my hands in my lap. And then I went back to work. There's something they don't tell you about betrayal. They tell you it hurts. Yes, it does. They tell you it changes you. Yes, it does. They tell you about the anger and the grief and the long nights when your mind won't stop turning it over, looking for the moment you missed, the sign you should have caught, the version of events in which you saw it coming. What they don't tell you is that betrayal is also clarifying. Not immediately. Not at first. But in the long after, in the months when you are rebuilding quietly the life that was dismantled, you begin to understand things about yourself and the people around you with a sharpness that was not available before. I understood that I had been very good at looking away. Not from Ryan, not from Jess, but from myself. From the small quiet voice that said every now and then, "You set yourself aside there. Did you mean to do that?" I had meant to, every time, because it felt kind, because it kept things smooth, because I loved them. But love without attention to yourself is not love. It's a slow giving away. I am more careful about that now. I understood that Jess was not a monster. This is the part that took the longest. Because it is so much easier to make someone a monster. To reduce them to the worst thing they did, to make that the whole of them, to look at 27 years of sisterhood and say, that was never real, none of it counted, she was always capable of this, and therefore none of the rest was true. But it's not true. Jess is a person. A complicated one like everyone. She did something terrible. She made choices over months that caused me immense harm, and she also loved me. Both things are true simultaneously, and the second thing does not excuse the first, and the first does not erase the second. What I came to understand is this: she was capable of it. That capability was always there. I didn't know about it, now I do. And I am not obligated to put myself back in proximity to it. That is not bitterness. That is information. I understood something about Ryan too. He was not, as I had believed, the person who would always tell me the truth. That was a version of him I had constructed, partly from evidence and partly from hope. Real Ryan was someone who, when faced with something difficult, chose the path of least immediate confrontation and most long-term damage. That is a kind of cowardice. It is a very human kind of cowardice. I don't hate him for it. I don't think about him very much. The wedding I planned, the one that didn't happen, sometimes visits me in unexpected ways. The font I chose for the name cards. The sage green bridesmaid dresses. The song I had picked for the first dance, which I couldn't listen to for 8 months and then one day heard in a shop and stood there and waited for it to hurt, and it didn't quite. There is a particular grief for the future you were building. Not for the person it was built with, or not only for them, but for the future itself. The imagined life. The specific shape you had given to the next 40 years. That shape has to be undone, and then slowly over time rebuilt into something else. My shape now looks different from what I imagined. It is smaller in some ways and larger in others. It is Aunt Carol in it with wine and good conversation. It is Biscuit asleep at the foot of my bed. It is work I love, done well, with the full attention I can now give it because I am not busy managing the distance between what I feel and what I say. It has cautiously the possibility of my mother, a different version of our relationship, more honest, with less of the old unspoken agreements that neither of us chose consciously. It does not have Jess in it yet. Maybe not for a long time, maybe not ever in the same form. That is the shape of things. I was at a wedding last autumn. A couple I had worked with for 10 months who had been so careful about every detail, so full of specific love for the day they were building. The venue was a converted barn in the countryside. The flowers were exactly as they'd imagined. The light was extraordinary. I stood at the edge of the room and watched them say their vows. The way they looked at each other. The particular quality of that attention, focused, open, unmixed with anything else. I waited to feel something difficult. I didn't. I felt unexpectedly, genuinely, without performance, glad. Glad for them, glad to be there. Glad to be someone who gets to stand in rooms where love is being made into something official and witnessed and held. I thought, I still believe in this. Everything that happened, the Tuesday, the seating charts, the 5 months I didn't know about, and I still believe in this. In the thing that makes two people stand in a barn in autumn light and mean what they say to each other. That surprised me. I think it was the most important thing I've learned. Betrayal doesn't create who people are. I want to leave you with that. Because I think we tell ourselves a story when someone hurts us that says they've become someone new, they've changed. The person I knew was real and this other person appeared. But that's not what happened. Jess didn't become someone capable of betrayal. She always was. I just loved her in a way that left no room for that knowledge. That's not my failure. It's just the nature of loving people completely. It requires a kind of blindness that isn't stupidity, it's trust. And trust can be broken. And when it is, what you're left with is information. What you do with that information is entirely up to you. I chose to use it, to understand myself better, to love more carefully, not less but more carefully, to pay attention to the small quiet voice that I had been talking over for years. I chose myself. That's the whole story. That's always the whole story. If you've been through something like this, if someone in your life has revealed themselves to be someone you didn't know, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you learned. Tell me what you're still carrying. Tell me where you are now. I read every single comment, everyone. And if Claire's story reached you today, if it hit something real, share it with one woman in your life who might need to hear it. You might not know she needs it. She might not know she needs it, but share it anyway. Hit subscribe for a new story every week. Because next week's story is one I have been sitting with for a while. It's about a woman who found out the truth about her marriage in the most unexpected way possible. And what she did next, I think, will genuinely surprise you. I'll see you there.